Judge Watson thought his sentence would scare the 17-year-old. But when the teen stood up and said something that made the entire court exclaim, "This is unbelievable," the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Faces turned expectantly toward the front of the room, where a teenage boy sat at the defendant's table. Silas Howard, 17 years old, sat with his hands folded neatly before him. Dressed in a plain button-up and slacks that were slightly too big for his lean frame, he looked more like a student attending a school debate than a criminal facing trial. And yet, here he was, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The allegations painted him as reckless, but his composed demeanor suggested something else entirely. At the judge's bench, Judge Cooper Watson adjusted his glasses and peered down at the boy with barely concealed disdain. He had seen hundreds of cases like this before, troubled youths who thought they could outsmart the system. He sighed, already eager to move things along. The sooner this trial was over, the sooner he could take his wife shopping, as promised. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Howard," he began, his tone laced with mockery, "are you sure you're in the right place? You look more like you belong in a high school debate club than in my courtroom." Laughter rippled through the spectators, and even the prosecution allowed themselves a small smirk. Silas, however, didn't react. He sat still, his expression unreadable. If anything, there was the faintest hint of amusement in his dark eyes. Judge Watson leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he had set the tone. The boy would soon learn that the courtroom was no place for games. He gestured toward the prosecution. "Mr. Richardson, proceed." Leonardo Richardson, the prosecuting attorney, stood confidently. Tall, well-dressed, and seasoned in his field, he approached the jury with an air of certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is an open and shut case. The defendant, Silas Howard, was caught behind the wheel of a stolen Audi A8. He fled from law enforcement, putting others at risk. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The arresting officer, Officer Ruiz, will testify that he personally witnessed the defendant in the vehicle. The evidence is undeniable." Richardson turned to face Silas, his eyes narrowing slightly. What kind of innocent person runs from the police? The question hung in the air, pressing down on Silas like a weight. Still, the boy did not flinch. He simply observed, taking in every word, every assumption, every mistake that no one else seemed to notice. Judge Watson gave an approving nod, as if the case had already been decided. "Sounds straightforward to me," he muttered. At the defense table, Lisa Thornton, Silas's court-appointed attorney, shifted nervously. She was young, fresh out of law school, and this was one of her first major cases. She had reviewed the evidence thoroughly, but against an experienced prosecutor like Richardson, she felt out of her depth. Her fingers trembled slightly as she prepared to speak, but before she could, Silas gently placed a hand on her arm. She turned to him, startled. He shook his head once, a silent request to let him handle it. She hesitated, but, for some reason, found herself nodding. Judge Watson raised an eyebrow. "Something you'd like to say, Mr. Howard?" Silas finally smiled, just a small, knowing smirk. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the jury, the judge, the prosecutor. They all thought they had him cornered. They all thought this was over, before it had even begun. Taking a deep breath, he slowly stood, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady, confident. "Your Honor," he said, "before we proceed any further, I'd like to clarify a few things about the law." The room fell silent. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the space, leaving only an eerie void. The murmurs ceased, The shuffling of papers stopped, and even the faint creak of wooden benches seemed to vanish. For a moment, it felt as though the entire courtroom had been frozen in time, transformed into a ghostly, abandoned place where not a single soul dared to move. Judge Watson's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" Silas tilted his head slightly. "It seems like we're all in a hurry to wrap this up, but I believe there are a few legal oversights we should discuss first." Richardson scoffed, his lips curling into a smirk as he crossed his arms over his chest. He tilted his head slightly, narrowing his sharp, calculating eyes at Silas. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he gestured toward the boy, his fingers splaying dramatically. "And what would you know about the law, kid?" Silas's smirk deepened. Richardson's words were the kind that would make any teenager in his position shrink in fear, their confidence dissolving under the weight of authority. But not Silas. He stood motionless, his expression calm, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the defense table. "More than you think." For the first time since the trial began, Judge Watson hesitated. There was something in Silas's tone, something unsettlingly self-assured. The judge had seen many defendants act cocky before, but this wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. And that was the moment Watson realized. This case was not going to be as simple as he thought. Then, "If you want to see what happens next, don't forget to hit the like button. The most shocking twist is coming soon." Then, as the silence stretched, Silas took a deep breath and straightened his posture. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I have decided to represent myself." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Murmurs erupted among the spectators, disbelief flashing across their faces. Judge Watson arched an eyebrow, an incredulous smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "You? Represent yourself?" he scoffed, his lips curling upward in a slow, exaggerated sneer. His voice dripped with mock amusement, and the corners of his mouth twitched as if barely holding back laughter. This should be entertaining. Across the room, Richardson chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, this just made my job even easier," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He turned toward the jury, arms gesturing dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a high school student attempting to play lawyer. This should be quick." Silas remained unfazed. He let the words settle, drawing out the moment, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically. The amused expressions in the room slowly faded as his steady gaze swept over the courtroom. When he finally spoke again, his voice was controlled, deliberate. "Mr. Richardson," Silas said smoothly, "can you confirm that Officer Ruiz witnessed me in the stolen vehicle before my arrest?" Richardson, still smirking, nodded. "Absolutely. Officer Ruiz saw you behind the wheel. His testimony is clear." Silas tilted his head slightly. "Interesting, because Officer Ruiz wasn't even at the scene of the crime." The room froze. The murmurs started again, this time more urgent. Judge Watson sat forward, his expression darkening. "Explain yourself, Mr. Howard." Silas adjusted his sleeves, his confidence unwavering. "I'd like to request GPS records from Officer Ruiz's patrol car at the time of my alleged crime. If he was where he claims to be, the data will confirm it. If not, then his testimony is compromised." Richardson's smirk faltered. His lips parted slightly as he glanced at the judge. The hesitation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Judge Watson turned to Richardson, his brows furrowing deeply. The rigid lines on his face softened for a split second, betraying his surprise. His lips parted slightly, as if caught between disbelief and intrigue. For the first time that morning, his demeanor shifted from condescension to curiosity. "Do you have any objections?" Richardson hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for the jury to notice. "No, Your Honor," he finally said, his voice lacking its previous confidence. Silas leaned back slightly, observing the shift in atmosphere. The amused sneers were gone. In their place was something far more valuable: doubt. The case was no longer as open and shut as everyone had believed. For the first time, Judge Watson sighed heavily. This was going to be much more complicated than he had anticipated. He rubbed his temple, muttering under his breath, "Looks like I won't be making it home in time for that shopping trip after all." Richardson straightened his posture and cleared his throat, determined to regain control of the narrative. "Let's not get distracted, Your Honor," he said firmly. "The most damning piece of evidence remains unchanged. Silas Howard's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That fact alone places him in the car." Silas nodded slightly, his expression untroubled. "You're right, Mr. Richardson. My fingerprints were there." A murmur spread through the courtroom, confusion evident on the faces of the jury members. "But let me ask you this. Let's say you walk into a store and try on a jacket. Your wife sees you in it and scoffs, saying, 'That jacket makes you look ridiculous,' so you put it back and leave. Later, that jacket goes missing, and suddenly, you're the prime suspect. Does that make you a thief?" Silas let his words settle before continuing. "Or imagine test driving a car at a dealership. You check the mirrors, grip the wheel, maybe even take it around the block. A day later, the car is reported stolen. Would that make you the criminal?" Some of the jurors exchanged glances, considering his words. A few members of the audience whispered among themselves. The certainty that had once filled the courtroom was beginning to waver. In reality, Silas continued, "I touched the car, yes. But I didn't steal it. It was parked outside a convenience store, and I was curious. The engine was left running, and the door wasn't fully closed. The car made a strange noise, and I, being a responsible person, got inside to turn it off and properly shut the door to secure it for its owner. The prosecution is using circumstantial evidence to paint me as guilty, without real proof." He turned back to Richardson. "Tell me, did the prosecution call in a fingerprint expert to testify on the integrity of the evidence? Were there any checks on how long my prints had been there?" Judge Watson arched an eyebrow and shifted his gaze toward Richardson, who hesitated. "We did not feel the need, given the overwhelming evidence." Silas's lips curled into a knowing smile. "So, no verification of the timeline, no forensic expert to back up the claim. Then tell me, Your Honor, how can the prosecution prove beyond reasonable doubt that those prints weren't from before the car was stolen?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Watson massaged his temples, realizing that Silas had just exposed a significant weakness in the prosecution's case. Richardson opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, he had no immediate answer. Silas took a steady breath before speaking again. "Your Honor, I request that we review the testimony of the vehicle's owner, Mr. Raymond Whitaker." Judge Watson frowned at the mention of Whitaker. After a brief pause, he sighed and nodded. "The request by Mr. Howard is granted. Proceed with the testimony." Silas looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the jury, the judge, and finally the prosecution. He then turned directly to Richardson, his expression unwavering. "I want to ask you, why is the vehicle owner's testimony missing from your case file? Is this a careless oversight by the officers, or was it a deliberate omission on your part?" Richardson took a half-step back, his face betraying a mix of surprise and a hint of fear. He opened his mouth, as if to respond, but before he could utter a word, Silas had already turned his attention to the judge. Silas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and began reading aloud. I am Raymond Whitaker, the owner of the stolen vehicle. This afternoon, I went into a convenience store to buy a few things. I left my car running, and at one point, a black teenager entered the car. But he was not the thief. The actual thief was a young white male, around 20 years old. Silas met the judge's gaze. Because Mr. Whitaker provided a statement to the police that was omitted from this case, he clearly described the actual thief as a young white male, not me. A shocked murmur spread through the courtroom. Silas continued. This crucial testimony was ignored by the prosecution, and it directly contradicts their claims. Are we here to pursue justice, or just convenient convictions? Judge Watson sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as he realized the case was unraveling. He turned to Richardson. Do you have anything to add, Mr. Richardson? Richardson's face flushed red as he shuffled his notes, searching for a response. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to come up with a defense. Judge Watson exchanged a long glance with the jury, then sighed and conferred with them briefly. As they all nodded in agreement, he stood up, scanning the courtroom, before letting his eyes settle on Richardson. After a brief pause, he turned to Silas. Judge Watson straightened, his voice firm. The case against Silas Howard is dismissed. A mix of gasps and murmurs filled the room. Some spectators were in shock, while others sighed in relief. The press scribbled furiously, already crafting headlines. Silas, however, remained calm, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom. As Silas gathered his things and took his first steps toward the exit, Judge Watson called out from behind him, Mr. Howard. Silas turned back, just as the judge hurried toward him. Though he had only taken a few steps, Watson was already breathing heavily. He straightened his robe, catching his breath before speaking. I want to offer you some advice, not as a judge, but as if you were my own son. I believe you should seriously consider applying to law school. This country, this community, your community, needs people like you to protect and advocate for justice. Silas's face registered genuine surprise. He hadn't expected the once arrogant judge to offer him sincere advice. He let a small smile form before responding. I've had that in mind since I was 13, when I memorized the Criminal Procedure Code. Thank you for your advice, Your Honor. Outside, reporters crowded, shouting questions, but Silas ignored them, pulling his hood over his head. His mother, Denise Howard, stood waiting, her expression a mix of worry and relief. You scared me half to death, she said, pulling him into a tight hug. Silas chuckled. I had to take the risk, Mom. Meanwhile, Judge Watson watched from a distance, his usual arrogance replaced by contemplation. The case had revealed more than a miscarriage of justice. It had exposed systemic failures. Within hours, social media exploded with discussions. Was it police negligence or prosecutorial misconduct? The Internal Affairs Division announced an investigation into Richardson, and soon after, the district attorney suspended him, pending further review. Past accusations surfaced, allegations of coercion, racial bias, and even personal misconduct involving young women, unaware of their legal rights. This case became more than just Silas Howard's exoneration. It became a reckoning for the justice system. But as Silas reflected, he couldn't help but wonder. How many other black individuals had been wrongfully accused, their lives derailed by a system riddled with bias, corruption, and unchecked power? He had proven his innocence, but how many others had fallen victim to the same system without the chance to fight back? As Silas walked away from the courthouse, he glanced back at the flag waving outside the building. He knew that he would return to this place many times in the future, not as a defendant, but as a lawyer, a protector of his community, a defender of justice for Black Americans, and a guardian of the nation. Thank you for following this story to the end. We know you value justice and fairness. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories, not just about Silas, but about others fighting for justice.